talk is entitled Telling Animals, and I mean that in a few different senses, but for the sake of time, I'm going to just say that it's mostly about the most obvious one, which is telling things to animals. This is, so back in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was very interested in the idea of artificial symbiosis, but establishing symbiosis is kind of a 1 million year, 2 million year kind of thing, so it's hard to get done in a lifetime. So On Beyond Duckling is a bunch of different things, but in many ways it's also meant to be a reverse cyborg of a sort, and also an experiment in thinking about the Frankenstein story and how that was so much connected to violence, and what it would be like to make something that was more pathetic than Frankenstein but had the same trouble as his monster. Actually not having anything else in the world that was like you, and then trying to deal with that situation. So On Beyond Duckling, you put it in a pond, and then it finds the middle of the pond and does a mating ritual for the mate that was never built. But it's also using these pieces of found materials that are natural materials. Oars is made out of feathers, and eggshells as pontoons. Objects that are pretty gracile in many ways, but are super functional ultimately in how you can use them. And part of the reason I'm showing you On Beyond Duckling is that the relationship that it had with the animals, I thought, would be, in some ways these are experiments in cohabitation, objects that can exist with the animals that are already in these places. But the animals that it had the most complicated relationships with were actually fish, and I'll come back to that in a little bit maybe. In another sense of telling animals, I was making these objects that I put out, and in this case, using kind of a leaf semaphore. This will explain the functioning of the internal combustion engine to chipmunks and deer and things like that. And in many ways, it kind of felt in 2005, and especially now that we haven't totally informed all the other animals as to what we're doing, and especially things like the internal combustion engine, which has a huge effect on them, but they're not really aware of it. Following on from On Beyond Duckling, I made Duck, Duck, Goose, and made a mating pair of animals. Again, the feathers allow a functional sort of thing to be achieved. The object itself, like birds, can sense the Earth's magnetic field and therefore know which way it's pointed. And so the two robots, On Beyond Father Gander and On Beyond Mother Goose, can do this synchronized mating ritual, even though they're 3 miles apart from one another, one down on a lake and one up in a forest near some cows. I still haven't actually made any robots that can mate with each other, even though I did eventually get into kind of sex bots, which I'll come around to in a moment. So I was asked to make a big robot as part of an event in Pittsburgh, and on top of the Andy Warhol Museum, I built this giant hand, for the sense of scale, that's about 22 feet tall. And those are 45-pound bench weights that are part of this whole system that can power it. And in many ways, I was hoping to give back to the animals by showing some appreciation. So other body parts that were around town, a breast and an ear, and the breast says, the breast says 1 pound of flesh, but the ear says ear number 1, and there's a nose that says nose your number. But in any case, when pigeons would go to those places, these sort of extensions of this sports fan that was made out of foam sticking out of Pittsburgh all over the place, the pigeons would be detected, and then this thing would kind of would tell them that they were number 1. But the main problem, and then a problem with a lot of the things I'm going to show you, is that there was no way for the pigeons to really know that they were being appreciated by this giant robot that I built. Sort of related, about that time I had a space agency that was about 2 things, helping little robots realize their dreams and non-human animals enter the space race. But I bring up this in this conversation because we were talking about Umwelt, and we were talking about the interiority of robots, and to some extent, these pieces that are about both how the animals respond to these things and how humans can understand what they're doing, but also about the way in which the robots have their own Umwelt, their own experience. And in this series, I was making these robots that believed they were doing what the rock star robots do, which is to go to other celestial bodies and look for life, which is what JPL does. Of course, I think there's a bunch of people here from JPL, but I was imagining that Roombas do this in their minds. And in this case, in sort of like the allegory of the cave, I'd make robots that themselves were faked into thinking that that was what they were doing. But I won't belabor that too much because I do want to keep going. So with the pigeon robot in Pittsburgh, there was a definite sense that communication had failed. And I didn't really talk about this a lot, but that had been a theme for about 10 15 years from like 95 onward, making these things that couldn't actually communicate, but we're trying to, with Ambient Duckling and with my leaf semaphore robot. So in this case, I decided to move into signals that were already salient to the animals because they were the signals that the animals themselves used. And with Dangerous Squirrel Nutkin, I mean, this video actually sort of explains it a little bit, but it's a system that has a camera, and the camera is looking for squirrel predators like dogs and cats, and to some extent hawks, but definitely people. And it uses the squirrel's own tail flick alarm signal to tell them about the threat. And it actually amplifies it using what's called a supernormal stimulus by the biologist, a guy named Nico Tinbergen, discovered this in Stickleback quite a ways back. And in this case, by having 3 tails, I'm imagining it's more of a klaxon. It's more of a really loud saying of, there's something bad happening. But, and the squirrels indeed respond to it, which, there's an aspect of these work that's about bodies and what bodies are different from our own, and in many ways also allowing that kind of experience that we wish to have with animals that we pretend we have, like the Snow White sort of experience where the animal comes and lands on your hand and you commune with it deeply, when in fact, in most cases, it's just that the animal wants to eat what you have and cares very little for you, and also can't really be engaged with because your body is so not appropriate. So if you can build new bodies, as I tried to do, you can allow an object to actually have that kind of experience to some extent, to actually enter the conversation with squirrels. Yeah, it does has a side benefit. It distracts the predators. But I don't want to omit the fact that to some extent this is also meant to be an absurdist critique of technopositivism, because right off the bat I have definitely entered this thing and undone things for the predator, and I'm taken sides and possibly disrupted the entire setup for everybody. So just before the Woodiest, which is the first sex bot I recognize as being a sex bot, I made a system that was designed to help pileated woodpeckers, which are a North American species, and black woodpeckers, which are a Eurasian species, communicate with each other when global climate change resulted in their meeting each other after eons of having been separated despite being in the same genus. And so the robot would listen for the territorial drumming of one and then translate it into the territorial drumming of the other, hopefully trying to mitigate the sort of migration crisis that was going on between these two species. And then in Morse code, it would explain climate change to them, sort of along the same lines as the leaf semaphore robot, so that we were kind of helping them out. But then I was asked to make something about extraterrestrial sex, and for the most part, I'm sort of I'm a Beatrix Potter lover, and even though I'm very much also exploring the way in which we tell stories about animals, and that's another sense of telling animals, because famously we are storytelling animals, and we end up reinventing what animals are really like, and this work is also about finding out what animals actually are like. Speaking to what Bill was saying earlier about collaborations with animals, for the most part, I'll have stories going into a process about what's going to happen, and then through prototypes that actually do interact with the animals, and that way it does become kind of collaborative with the animals, that'll get closer and closer to what the animals actually do. So I think maybe I'll just say in passing, and you can talk to me about it later, that what this ultimately is a autoerotic hermaphroditic woodpecker sex bot. And I guess I'll play I'm going to skip it because I don't want to take too much time. Oops. So when I had made that piloted, Nobody Told the Woodpeckers, which is the robot that explained global climate change to piloted black woodpeckers, I spent the whole time I was in Munich on this residency, like 3 months, trying to find black woodpeckers and couldn't do it. And so I sort of segued away from that and I came up with rule number 14, which is to work with only local and abundant animals. And on a sort of autobiographical note, back in the early 90s, I was super interested in looking for the Loch Ness Monster. And that's what got me into underwater robots. And eventually, the arc of that whole thing is that I started with large animals that live in the depths of things that are really hard to find, possibly because they don't exist. And because of that experience with that woodpecker and rule number 14, now I mostly work with animals that are pretty small and that I can find every day, like these lizards that live behind my house that are engaged in these sort of push-up battles all the time. And so I won't go into too much detail, but essentially, I think of these robots as kind of like gunslingers. They do these territorial push-ups, and whenever they meet one another, then they'll do them, and they'll have a sort of standoff. And just like in Westworld, the original and kind of the remake, I've put a robot in there that enters these territorial disputes, and through gesture only. Through gesture only, maybe a little less so in this case, there's a information passed between them. But ultimately, and this is relates a little bit to Danger Squirrel Nuck, and the animals have these energetic needs that they have to fulfill. They have lots of things they have to do. They have to eat, and they have to mate, and they have to defend themselves from predators. But my robot doesn't do anything but fight for territory, and ultimately that means that the lizards lose. And this is a follow-on from that. Again, it's a supernormal stimulus, and the main thing I'll say about it is that I was trying to reduce the morphological aspects of the object more and make it that the gestural elements, that's not the right thing to do, would be the only remaining stuff. And it also make what I called an Uber-Eidelsche, which is a super lizard, a lizard that would be able to declare territory to such an extent that no lizard would be able to compete. And initially I thought that it would become a god for the lizards and they would surround it and do push-ups for it. But instead, they just give it a really wide berth, which means it's either super successful or it's just a novel object that they won't tolerate. But it hasn't really been out long enough, even though it's an old robot. Let me go on. I'm going to skip this one, and I'm just going to go to Marvelous Meat, and I'll start that playing. So I've noticed that there's no sound, but oh, there's a sound. Okay, great. When I was working with lizards and squirrels and with a lot of these other animals, I was working mostly with instinctual signals that are perceptible to the animals and also engaged in almost instinctually, definitely in the case of the lizards. When I had to do this project that I skipped over in Copenhagen, it was winter and the only animals that were actually active were magpies, and it put things in a totally different place where the signals that I ended up using kind of relied on the fact that corvids, magpies, crows, and ravens have some sense of, they potentially have a theory of mind. And so this beak wiping behavior, which is a functional behavior for cleaning the beak, can also be an aggressive thing, but it's also what's called a displacement activity, something that will be filled in with when there's a stimulus that maybe competing stimuli that would result in conflict and unresolved stuff. People do it too. And so I made this robot that is, again, sending a message. It's trying to find magpies and ravens and other corvids, essentially, that are nearby. And when it finds them, with this beak wiping, it tries to tell each of them a different story in Morse code. A slow wipe is a dash, and a fast wipe is a dot. And these stories are stories about the end of the world. Some of them are mythologies, ancient mythologies, Ragnarok sort of stuff, Mayan stuff, and stories that are from science about how the world might end due to all kinds of different things. And then also the stories that politicians tell their constituents about how the world is going to be brought about to end because of one group or another changing things for everybody. This was in 2016 during the summer. And so ultimately it becomes a duplicitous robot that is at its very core lying. But because these displacement activities, beak wiping is one of them, are often exhibited multiple times by animals that are super anxious. For instance, parrots will preen themselves to baldness, the preening also being a displacement activity. So when the corvids see this thing, potentially if they recognize it as being an entity like themselves, then the aura that it gives off is of extreme anxiousness. But then for people, there's a message built in there too. And in many ways, again, it's about this miscommunication by having a layering of an animal signal wrapped up in a human signal, wrapped up into kind of a technical thing, which is the Morse code. so that really no parties actually know what's going on. And where I think I'll end is to say that in many ways, a lot of this work is also about the robot's own experiences, as I sort of alluded to. And when I think about robots, and I am often thinking about robots, I worry about the robots to some extent. We have been engaged in the effort to make robots for quite a long time. I would say for at least thousands of years, despite the word itself only being 100 years old. And it's seeming more and more likely that we're actually going to succeed in what we really meant by robots, the idea of some sort of artificially intelligent robotic system where we've wrested the power that created ourselves and created something like ourselves. And especially in the mid-90s and even now, it feels as if when we do create those things, we will create them in the areas that we are some of the worst sort of activities that we're involved in fighting and war. And I am deeply interested in trying to help the robots have a different origin story, because as I think was alluded to earlier, we might not make it, and we might have made things that will make it, and it'll be the first time that something that we've made can reflect upon the nature of its own origins. And I'd like that story to be something that they'll enjoy telling to each other, rather than feeling as if they came from some of our worst stuff and that's our legacy. So that's where I'll end.